Benedict Crowell's boots hit the frozen ground hard as he stepped out of his carriage and looked up at Ironwood Ranch, like a man calculating the price of something that wasn't yet his. He didn't knock. He pushed the front door open without invitation, walked straight to the kitchen table where Thaddeus Wren was eating breakfast alone, and dropped a folded legal document into the man's scrambled eggs. "New Year's Day," Benedict said, pulling out a chair and sitting down as if he owned the place already. $700. Every cent. Or I take the land. Thaddeus didn't pick up the paper. He looked at Benedict across the table the way a man looks at something he's been dreading for a long time, and his jaw went tight, and he said nothing. Benedict smiled. "I've been patient," he said, "longer than most men would be." That smile was the thing. That easy, satisfied smile of a man who had already won, who was simply waiting for everyone else to understand it. If you've ever watched someone you care about be cornered by a person who holds all the power and knows that you already know, what came next is going to hurt before it gets better. Subscribe to this channel and hit the like button right now, because this story is just getting started, and I promise you, it goes places nobody in Coldwater Ridge expected. Drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. The wagon stopped a full mile below Ironwood Ranch. Not because the road was impassable, though it wasn't far from it. Not because the horse had gone lame, though the animal was blowing hard in the cold. The driver, a thick-necked man named Orville, who had been hauling freight and passengers through Coldwater Ridge for 11 years, pulled back on the reins and sat there on his bench without explanation for almost 30 seconds before Evelyn Harrow finally asked him what the problem was. "End of the line," Orville said. Evelyn looked up the road. The snow had packed into a solid crust from recent wind, and the tire ruts from previous wagons disappeared about 40 yards ahead, where the trail curved upward and the pines closed in on both sides. The sky was the color of old iron. She could see maybe 300 yards of open ground, and then nothing but trees and white. "It's a mile," she said. "About that. You were hired to deliver me to Ironwood Ranch. I was hired to deliver you to Coldwater Ridge." He half turned on his bench without fully looking at her. "Which I done. What happens north of the ridge isn't my problem." Evelyn sat with her medical case across her lap, and her traveling bag wedged between her feet and the footboard. She was 28 years old, and she had the kind of face that didn't give much away, which she had learned was useful in her line of work. She looked at the back of Orville's neck, at the way his shoulders had drawn up slightly, and she understood that this wasn't about the road. "You're afraid of him," she said. Orville's shoulders went up a little higher. "I don't know what you've heard, ma'am. I've heard what everyone's heard." She reached forward and retrieved her traveling bag herself, shifting the medical case to her other arm. 3 women left before Christmas. He screams in his sleep. He walks the property in the dark during blizzards. Half the town thinks he's lost his mind. She pulled open the wagon door from the inside and stepped down into the snow without waiting for him to offer a hand. Her boot went through the crust to mid-shin, and she steadied herself against the wheel. The other half thinks he was never entirely right to begin with. Orville finally turned to look at her fully. He had a broad, weathered face and the expression of a man who has spent years being told things he didn't want to hear. 3 women, he said again, as if the number carried moral weight. 3 women decided it wasn't worth their trouble. She pulled her boot free of the snow and adjusted her grip on the medical case. That's their business. She started up the road. "Miss Harrow." He called after her before she'd gone 10 feet. The last one, the Hendricks girl she left in January with her boots unlaced, in the middle of the night. She didn't even take her coat. Evelyn stopped walking. She stood with her back to him, and the cold working through her wool jacket, and the silence of the pines pressing in from both sides of the road. "That must have been very cold," she said, and kept walking. She heard him turn the wagon around behind her. She didn't look back. The walk took 45 minutes. The road climbed at an angle that wasn't steep but was steady, and the crust held her weight most of the way but broke through every dozen steps or so, and by the time she could see the ranch buildings through the trees, her right knee ached and her arms had gone from tired to burning. The medical case wasn't heavy by normal standards, but there was no normal standard for carrying it up an iced-over mountain road in the dark of a Montana December afternoon. Ironwood Ranch appeared in pieces. A fence post, then another, then the top of a barn roof with snow piled unevenly along the ridge. Then the main house, which was larger than she'd expected, 2 stories, solid timber construction, a covered porch running the full width of the front. It had the look of a place that had been built with intention and then neglected by degrees, the way most things go when the person who cared most about them isn't there anymore. A man was standing in the yard with his back to her, breaking ice on the water trough with the flat back of an axe. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, and working with the economical movements of someone who has performed the same task so many times it no longer requires thought. He didn't turn when she opened the gate. He didn't turn when her boot caught on the latch, and she stumbled and caught herself against the gatepost. He turned when she said, "Mr. Wren," not because she'd said his name. Because of how she said it level, no apology in it, the way you'd say it to someone you expected to turn around. He turned. Thaddeus Wren was 36 years old. That was the information she'd been given by the agency, along with the wage amount and the duration winter through early spring, and the single line that said the position had been vacated 3 times in the past year and a half. He had dark hair that had gone partly gray at the temples and a beard that wasn't carefully kept, but wasn't entirely neglected either. His eyes were a pale gray-green that caught the flat winter light in a way that made him look like he was always slightly calculating something. He looked at her, then at the traveling bag, then at the medical case, then back at her face. "You walked up," he said. The driver declined to complete the trip. Something moved across his expression that might have been displeasure, or might have been something else. "Orville, I didn't catch his last name." "No, just Orville." He drove the axe into the ground beside the trough and pulled a work glove off his right hand. "You're the healer, Evelyn Harrow." "Yes." He didn't offer his hand. He looked at her for another moment the way he'd looked at her bag and her case, like he was taking inventory. "You know what this position is. Winter household management and medical care when needed. The agency was clear enough. They tell you about the others?" They mentioned the position had been vacated 3 times. He picked up his axe and drove it into the chopping block near the barn door. "In 14 months. "So I've heard." He looked at her steadily. "And you still came." "I needed the work," Evelyn said. "And I finish what I start." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the tops of the pines above the fence line, and the sound it made was like something breathing. He picked up the axe again, looked at it, set it back down. "I have one rule," he said. "The north bedroom on the 2nd floor. You don't go in. You don't try the lock. You don't ask about it." "All right. That's all?" "Just all right. It's your house, Mr. Wren. You can have as many locked rooms as you want." She picked up her traveling bag. "Is there somewhere I can put my things?" He stared at her for what felt like a long time. Then he walked past her toward the front porch. "I'll show you the room," he said. "Kitchen's off the back. Whatever you need, you find it yourself." "I don't keep regular hours. I noticed," she said. He glanced back at her. The trough was iced over. "It's past 2 in the afternoon. I was out early," he said. "Had a fence line to check. In this weather. The cattle don't wait for good weather." She didn't say anything else. She followed him up the porch steps and through the front door and into the house. The room she was given was on the 1st floor, off the kitchen, with a single window that looked out onto the side yard and the woodpile. It was a small room with a narrow bed and a washstand and a single hook behind the door. Clean enough. Austere. The kind of room that had been prepared for someone's arrival, but without any warmth in the preparation sheets, pulled tight, floor swept, and nothing else. She set down her bags and stood in the middle of it for a minute. Upstairs, she could hear his boots on the floorboards. Slow, even, moving from one end of the hall to the other, and back again. She opened her medical case and began inventorying what she had. Carbolic, bandaging, forceps, a bone saw she hoped she wouldn't need. The small brown bottle of laudanum she kept for extreme cases, and used as sparingly as she could manage because she had watched, up close, what happened to people who came to need it too much. A suture kit, 3 kinds of poultice ingredients packed in muslin pouches, a well-worn copy of a practical medical reference she'd bought secondhand from a retired surgeon who'd told her, when she paid him, that she was throwing her money away because no one out west was going to let a woman doctor anything more serious than a scraped knee. She'd proved him wrong twice the week she arrived in the territory, once with a compound fracture and once with a difficult birth. She'd learned not to mention either story unless someone else brought it up first. She put everything back in order and went to find the kitchen. The kitchen was large and functional and had the same neglected orderliness as the rest of the house. Things were roughly in their place, but the place had stopped being cared for in any particular way. The stove was an older model but solid, and it was still warm from morning. She found coffee, flour, dried beans, some side meat wrapped in cloth in the cold pantry. She found a cracked dish that had been stacked back in the cupboard as if it might be useful later. She found an account book shoved between the flour canister and the wall that had entries going back 4 years, and the last 3 months of entries were sparse and irregular, and the final column of figures made her set it down carefully and think for a moment before she picked it up again. She was still reading through it when she heard him come into the kitchen. "I was going to start supper," she said without turning around. "I can have something ready in an hour." "You don't need to. It's part of the position." She set the account book down on the table where he could see she'd found it. "The accounts are short. Silence. I know," he said finally. "The November and December entries are incomplete." "I know that too." She turned around. He was standing in the doorway with his coat still on, and he was looking at the account book with an expression she couldn't quite place, not embarrassment, exactly, but something in that vicinity. Something that involved not wanting to be seen. "I wasn't going through your things," she said. "It was between the flour and the wall. I put it there. I assumed. You might want to know that the Caldwell account looks like it hasn't been reconciled since September. Miss Harrow." His voice came out flat and slightly strained. "Mr. Wren." He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand. A gesture that she would come to recognize the thing he did when he was working out how to say something he didn't particularly want to say. "The accounts are not your responsibility. They're the household accounts. That falls under household management." I know what you meant." She turned back to the stove and picked up the fire poker. "You meant that you'd rather I didn't see how bad it's gotten." She opened the firebox and began building up the heat. "I've seen worse. I worked in a mining town for 2 years before I came here. I'm not going to tell anyone in Coldwater Ridge about your ledger." She set the poker back on its hook. "But if you want me to help, I need to know what I'm working with." The silence stretched out long enough that she thought he'd left. When she finally looked back, he was still in the doorway, and his expression had shifted into something she couldn't read. "The beans will take an hour," she said. "If you have other work, you can come back then." He left. She heard his boots cross the front room, and then the sound of the back door, and then nothing. She picked up the account book and kept reading. The first night she woke at 2:30. Not gradually all at once, the way you wake when a sound has found you in the middle of a deep sleep, and your body has already processed it before your mind catches up. She lay in the narrow bed with her eyes open, and the darkness complete around her, and she heard it again. It was coming from upstairs, not words exactly, or not recognizable words. A voice, his voice. She was certain enough of that at a volume and pitch that wasn't a nightmare in the mild sense. It was something that had its own shape, its own architecture. It rose and fell with a rhythm that suggested it was telling something, working through something, and then it would cut off, and then begin again at a different register, and the silence in between was somehow worse than the sound itself. She sat up. She sat that way for almost 3 minutes, just listening. She understood, sitting there, what had sent the Hendricks girl running through the snow with her boots unlaced. Not fear exactly, or not only fear. It was the particular helplessness of lying in the dark and listening to someone suffer and knowing there is nothing useful you can do about it. And there is something about that particular helplessness that can feel like danger even when it isn't. She got up. She put on her wool robe and went to the kitchen and built up the fire in the stove. She filled the kettle. She set out 2 cups on the table, one for herself, one on the other side, and she sat and waited. She did not go upstairs. She did not stand at the bottom of the stairs and call up. She did not do anything except make the kitchen warm and the coffee ready and wait in the particular way you wait when you are respecting someone's right to fall apart. 35 minutes later, she heard the stairs. He came into the kitchen in his boots and his work pants and a shirt that wasn't fully buttoned, and he stopped when he saw her sitting at the table. He looked at the 2 cups. He looked at the stove, which was burning clean and steady. He looked at her face. She said nothing. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She poured the coffee. They sat together in the kitchen until almost 4 in the morning, and neither of them said a word. And when she finally went back to her room, she lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought, so that's what it is. That's what sent 3 women running. Not a monster. Not a man who was dangerous. A man who was drowning and doing it very loudly, and none of them had known how to stay in the water beside him. By the end of the first week, she had the household accounts sorted. It wasn't a flattering picture. The Caldwell debt she'd noticed on the first night was the smallest problem. There was a supplier in Billings who was owed for 3 months of grain. There was a note for fence materials from a hardware outfit in the next county that had been renewed twice and was running out of patience. And buried at the back of the ledger, written in a different hand than the rest of the entries neater, more deliberate, was a record of a loan guarantee. $700, dated 3 years back, signed by Thaddeus Wren as guarantor for his brother, whose name had been written as Daniel Wren, and beside the name, in a margin notation, a date and 2 words, killed, Yellowstone. She sat with that page for a long time. Then she closed the book and put it back between the flower and the wall where she'd found it, because that information wasn't hers yet, and she was going to have to wait until it was offered to her. That was one of the things she'd learned in 2 years of working as a healer in rough country. People told you what they needed you to know when they were ready to need you. Pressing them didn't make them ready faster. It just made them less willing to let you close enough to help when the time came. She went to check on the cattle. The cattle situation was precarious. 2 of the cows in the main barn were showing signs of respiratory trouble, a wet cough, eyes running, the kind of mild pneumonia that cold and stress could turn serious without much warning. She found the proper medicines in the supply room after a 40-minute search and treated both animals herself, then spent an hour reinforcing the draft ceiling around the barn's east-facing wall, which had gaps in it that the wind was exploiting. When Thaddeus came in from the north pasture that afternoon and found her up on a ladder with a hammer, he stopped in the barn doorway and watched her for almost a full minute before he said anything. "What are you doing?" "Filling the gaps." She drove a nail through a strip of cut leather she'd found in the harness room. "The 2 Herefords on the left have respiratory inflammation. It'll clear up, but they need the draft controlled or it'll come back." "You treated them?" "Yes. You're a healer. For people. Animals and people aren't as different as most people think." She came down the ladder and moved it 6 feet to the left and went back up. "The pharmacology is different. The anatomy is different. The general principles of keeping something alive in winter, less so." She heard him walk across the barn floor below her. He stopped near the 2 Herefords, and she could hear him checking them the way his weight shifted, the low sound he made in his throat when he was examining something. "How long on the treatment?" he said finally. 3 days to see whether it's working. 5 to 10 for full recovery if we keep the drafts down." She hammered in another nail. "They'll be fine." He didn't answer right away. "The hay storage needs to be moved," he said. "It's getting damp near the back wall. I saw that. I was going to suggest it." Another silence. "I'll do it after supper," he said, and then he left. She finished the gap ceiling in 40 minutes and climbed down and put the ladder back and looked at the 2 cows, whose eyes were already slightly less distressed than they'd been that morning. "Better by Thursday," she told them. "You'll see." They looked at her with the enormous mild patience of animals, who had no idea what she was saying, and found her presence mildly reassuring anyway. She went back to the house. It was the second week when the trouble started in Coldwater Ridge. She'd ridden in on a borrowed horse to pick up a supply order she'd arranged through the general store carbolic, mostly, and some bandaging she was running low on, and a particular kind of bone broth she couldn't make on short notice, and which the nearest patient she was currently monitoring would need in the next several days. The patient in question was an elderly woman named Mrs. Harrow, who lived 2 miles south of town and had been managing a slow-moving infection in her left foot that, if it wasn't managed carefully, was going to require a conversation nobody wanted to have. The general store was run by a man named Clem Story, who was amiable and well-organized and possessed of a quality that Evelyn had come to identify in small-town merchants throughout the territory, the ability to collect information without appearing to seek it. He knew things. He always knew things, and he shared them freely, though never maliciously or rarely maliciously. "How's Ironwood?" he said while he was pulling her order. "Fine," she said. "Wren giving you trouble?" "No." He set a paper-wrapped bundle on the counter and looked at her in a speculative way. 3 weeks, he said. "That's past the first. The Hendricks girl lasted 2. "I'm aware. People are saying you'll be gone by New Year's." Evelyn looked at him. "What people?" He spread his hands in a gesture that meant everyone. "There's a wager going. Richardson at the feed store started it. 5 to 1 you don't see February. And what are the stakes?" "Usual, $1 a head." She considered this. Tell Richardson I'll put in $1 myself. On February, Clem stared at her. On myself, she said. That I'm still at Ironwood in February. Can I do that? I suppose technically. He'll say you have an unfair advantage. Yes, Evelyn said. I suppose he'll say that. She picked up her bundle. The carbolic. Don't forget the carbolic. She was nearly back to the ranch when she saw the carriage. It was a good carriage, black lacquered wood, a matched pair of chestnuts, a driver in a proper coat with brass buttons. It was the kind of carriage that doesn't often come up a mountain road in December, and when it turned onto the Ironwood lane ahead of her, she felt a particular alertness, the kind she associated with situations that were about to become complicated. She didn't hurry. She came in through the gate at the same pace she'd been keeping, put the horse in the barn, and walked around to the front of the house where the carriage was stopped and where Thaddeus was standing on the porch step, and where the man who had climbed out of the carriage was still standing in the yard, with one hand resting on the gate as if he owned it. He was somewhere around 45. Well-made coat, good hat, the kind of boots that had been polished that morning. He had a broad, comfortable face with small blue eyes and the easy posture of a man who had been, for a long time, the most powerful person in most rooms he entered. Wren, he said. He hadn't looked at Evelyn yet. Crowell, Thaddeus said. His voice had a quality she'd heard only once before, when she'd come around a blind corner on the road and startled the borrowed horse a stillness that was also a preparation. Just a social call, Benedict Crowell said. Thought I'd see how you're getting on. He turned his head and looked at Evelyn with a brief, assessing interest that moved from her face to her medical case, to her general appearance and back to her face. Is this the healer? Miss Harrow, Thaddeus said. Yes. Crowell smiled. Heard about you in town. He turned back to Thaddeus. I heard she walked up from the road herself. Driver wouldn't bring her all the way. He made that decision, Thaddeus said. She must be persistent. He said it like it was a curiosity, the way you'd note that an animal had done something unexpected. Come inside, Wren. I have business to discuss. Thaddeus didn't move for a moment. Then he stepped aside and held the door. Evelyn went to the kitchen. She didn't try to listen. She started supper preparation and kept the kitchen noise to a minimum, not to eavesdrop, but because anything else would have been obvious and deliberate. The sitting room was off the front hallway, and the kitchen was at the back. And if she positioned herself near the pantry door, she wouldn't have been able to hear anything clearly, and she had no intention of doing so. What she heard, because the house was old, and the floorboards and walls were old, and voices carry differently in cold weather, was tone. Crowell's voice, which had a particular layered quality warmth on the surface, something harder underneath. Thaddeus's voice, which was shorter in its responses than usual, which meant less than one might think, because Thaddeus was short in his responses generally. She was cutting the side meat when she heard a chair scrape back, and then footsteps, and then Crowell's voice said something she didn't catch, and then one word she did catch, which was January, and then Thaddeus's voice, which said nothing she could make out, but the quality of which told her everything she needed to know about how he felt. Crowell left 20 minutes later. She heard the front door, and then the carriage, and then the sound of the chestnuts turning around in the lane. Thaddeus came into the kitchen. He went to the window and stood there looking out at nothing, and she let him stand there for a while before she said anything. Supper's in an hour, she said. I'm not hungry. You've been out since before dawn. You need to eat. Miss Harrow. He said it with more control than she expected. Not tonight. She looked at him. His hands were clasped behind his back, and his shoulders were high and tight in the way they got when he was holding something very carefully together. All right, she said. She finished making supper for herself, and she left a covered plate on the back of the stove where it would stay warm, and she didn't say anything else about it. In the morning, the plate was empty and washed and back in the cupboard. That night, the nightmares were worse than anything she'd heard before. It started around 1 o'clock, and it didn't have the usual shape, the rising and the falling and the gaps of silence. It was continuous. It had velocity. She lay in her room and listened, and felt the particular weight of a sound that a person is making without any part of their waking self involved in making it, the way a voice can carry things the waking mouth would never say. She got up. She made the coffee. She sat. He came down at 2:30, and when he came in this time, he didn't just look at the cups. He sat down and put both hands flat on the table and kept his eyes down, and his jaw worked once. And then he said, "He holds the note." Evelyn poured the coffee. "My brother's debt. Daniel. He died 3 years ago. The loan guarantee passed to me. He picked up the cup without drinking from it. Crowell bought the note from the original lender. He's been waiting. Until January, Evelyn said. Thaddeus looked up at her. I heard the word, she said. I wasn't listening for it. He set the cup down. $700. New Year's Day, and you don't have it. He said nothing, which was its own answer. How much do you have? Enough to cover the grain supplier. Maybe half the hardware note. He rubbed his hands together above the table. A slow pressing motion. Not 700. Can you negotiate an extension? The look he gave her was brief and almost bitter. With Crowell? She understood. A man like Crowell doesn't buy a debt note and wait 3 years because he wants the money. He wants the land, she said. He wants all of it. He's wanted this acreage since before I came back from the war. Thaddeus stood up abruptly and went to the window, facing away from her. He made an offer 6 years ago. Ruth and I turned him down. After she died, he stopped. Evelyn waited. He waited, Thaddeus said. He's good at waiting. What about the horses? He turned around. What about them? The 4 breeding horses in the south barn. They're exceptional animals. I've seen what horses like that sell for. His expression shifted in a way she wasn't prepared for. It went from strained and careful to something rawer, something that had less control in it. Those horses, he said, are not something I'll discuss. I'm not asking you to discuss them. I'm asking if you've thought about. I said I won't discuss it. She held his gaze. He held hers back. The kitchen was quiet, except for the stove. All right, she said, for the second time that night. He stood at the window for another minute. Then he came back to the table and sat down and picked up the coffee, and this time he drank from it. They sat there together in the warm kitchen, while the night pressed in against the windows and the cold worked at every gap in the walls that she hadn't yet managed to seal, and neither of them said anything, and she thought, he told me. He didn't have to. He could have managed all of this inside himself, the way he'd apparently been managing everything else. For 3 years, the grief, the debt, the nights that turned on him like something alive. But he told her. She poured the second cups and looked at his hands around the mug and thought, there's something still holding together in this man. Something that hasn't given up yet, even when he thinks it has. She just needed to be careful not to be the thing that broke it. The morning after Crowell's visit, Thaddeus was up before 4. Evelyn heard him moving around upstairs, and then the stairs, and then the back door, and she lay in the dark and listened to the sound of boots crossing frozen ground toward the barn, and thought about a man who had told her something he probably hadn't told anyone else in 3 years, and then had gone to bed and had the worst night of sleep she'd witnessed yet, and was now out working in the dark at 4 in the morning, because that was the only thing left that made sense to him. She got up and made the coffee and left it on the back of the stove where it would stay hot. She did not go to the barn. She had learned, in the 2 weeks she'd been at Ironwood, that there was a particular kind of help that wasn't help at all the kind that followed a person into the places they went to be alone, that pressed its concern into spaces that needed air, not company. She had made that mistake once, in the mining town, with a man who'd lost 3 fingers in a shaft collapse and had taken to sitting alone behind the assay office in the evenings. She'd gone out there twice with food and conversation. Before she understood that what he needed was for someone to trust him to come back on his own. And once she understood that, she stopped going. And 2 weeks later, he had walked into the kitchen of the boarding house where she was staying and sat down at the table and started talking. And he talked for 2 hours without stopping. Thaddeus came in at 6:30. He saw the coffee. He poured himself a cup without saying anything and sat down at the table with the account book open in front of him, which told her he'd retrieved it from between the flower and the wall at some point. And he sat there going through entries with a pencil, making small notations, the same way a man might go through a battlefield map, looking for an exit that isn't there. She made breakfast. She set a plate in front of him without asking whether he wanted it. He ate half of it and pushed the rest aside and kept working in the ledger. The Caldwell entry from October, she said, setting her own plate on the table across from him. It looks like it was reconciled, but the credit column is off by $30. He looked up. I can fix it, she said, if you want. You've already been through the whole book. Twice. The first time I was looking for the shape of it. The second time I was looking for errors. She sat down. There are 4. 3 of them are minor. The October Caldwell entry is the largest. He closed the book, opened it again, turned to the October page and looked at it, And she watched him see what she was talking about, the small transposition in the credit column that would have seemed like a rounding issue until you traced it forward and found where it had compounded. I did these myself after Ruth died, he said. She used to do them. Evelyn said nothing. She was better at it than I was. Better at most things that involved keeping track of details. He turned a few pages without really looking at them. I've had 3 years to get worse at it without anyone noticing. I noticed, Evelyn said. I know. He looked up at her, and for a moment the careful blankness he usually maintained wasn't quite in place, and what was underneath it was something tired and something that had been carrying too much weight for too long. That seems to be what you do. It's a hazard of the work, she said. You spend enough time looking for what's wrong in the body, you start doing it everywhere. The corner of his mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile, but close enough that she registered it. Fix the Caldwell entry, he said, if you want. She reached across the table and pulled the book toward her. They finished breakfast in a companionable silence that wasn't quite comfortable, but was no longer the particular uncomfortable silence of two strangers who didn't know what to do with each other, which was something. It was progress. Small, incremental, the kind that doesn't look like anything when you're in the middle of it. By the 3rd week, word had gotten around Coldwater Ridge that the Ironwood healer was still in place. Clem Story's store had become a kind of informal information exchange on the subject, which was how most things worked in small settlements, where the general store functioned as both mercantile and community notice board. People came in for flour and left with updates. The wager, 5-1 against February, had apparently attracted 12 participants, and Richardson at the feed store had reportedly taken the unusual step of writing the stakes down in a ledger of his own, which meant he considered the bet serious business. Evelyn knew about all of this because Mrs. Farrow told her. Mrs. Farrow had graduated from the infection management phase of her treatment and was now in what Evelyn thought of as the maintenance and supervision phase, which required a weekly visit and a careful examination of the foot, and a frank conversation about whether the woman was doing the things she'd been told to do, which she mostly was because Mrs. Farrow had reached an age where she had no patience for anything that wasn't straightforward. They're saying you'll run, Mrs. Farrow said on the 3rd weekly visit, seated in her kitchen chair with her bad foot resting on a stool, and her expression one of mild entertainment. She was 71 and had outlived 2 husbands and a drought and a particularly bad winter in the late 60s that had taken a number of her neighbors, and she had the clear-eyed, unsentimental quality that sometimes came from having survived too many things to be easily frightened by new ones. Let them say it, Evelyn said. She was examining the foot with careful hands, checking the margins of the affected area. Richardson's got 12 people in the pool. I know. I put $1 in myself. Mrs. Farrow looked at her sharply. On yourself? Seemed like the right bet. There was a pause and then Mrs. Farrow made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a cough and said, Lord above, you're going to be trouble for that town. I'm going to be a healer for that town, Evelyn said. If they'll let me. How's Wren? Managing. She pressed gently along the edge of the treated area, checking for heat. The infection in the foot is retreating well, Mrs. Farrow. Keep doing what you're doing. That's not what I asked. Evelyn looked up. Mrs. Farrow was watching her with the particular attentiveness of a woman who had been reading people for 7 decades and had gotten good at it. He's managing, Evelyn said again. That's the honest answer. People in town think he's not right. Mrs. Farrow's voice was neutral, stating fact rather than opinion. The nightmares. The walking. 3 women who wouldn't stay. 3 women who made a choice, Evelyn said, which they were entitled to make. And you've made a different one. I've made a different one for now. I'll reassess in February. She began rewrapping the foot. How's the pain level in the mornings? Mrs. Farrow accepted the change of subject with the grace of a woman who knew when she'd gotten as much as she was going to get. Better than last week, she said. Still stiff when I first stand up. That'll continue for a while. It's not cause for alarm. Evelyn tied off the bandage. Same again next week. And if the color changes or the swelling returns before then, you send someone to get me. Don't wait. I know. Mrs. Farrow lowered her foot carefully from the stool. You're a good healer, Miss Harrow. I try to be. You're a better healer than you let on. Evelyn looked at her. Women who are only good at one thing don't put themselves in a position like Ironwood, Mrs. Farrow said simply. They find easier situations. You put yourself there on purpose. She settled back in her chair. I'm just noting it. Evelyn picked up her medical case. Same time next week, she said, and let herself out before the conversation could go anywhere else. She was halfway back to Ironwood when the snow started in earnest. Not the light, drifting snow that had been falling off and on for 2 weeks, but the kind with weight and direction behind it, the kind that arrives with a purpose and intends to stay. She pushed the borrowed horse to a faster pace and made it back to the barn, with the wind picking up hard from the northwest and the temperature dropping in the particular steep, quick way that meant the night was going to be serious. She put the horse up, made sure the barn was secured, and went inside. Thaddeus was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a piece of paper covered in calculations that she recognized from 2 steps away as his attempts to find $700 that wasn't there. "Blizzard tonight," she said, stamping snow off her boots. "I know." He didn't look up. "The north pasture fence has 2 sections that won't hold if we get more than a foot of accumulation. I need to get out there before dark. It'll be dark in 40 minutes. Then I need to go now." He stood up and went for his coat, and she stood in the kitchen and watched him and thought about saying something, and then didn't, because there wasn't anything useful to say. The fence either held or it didn't. The cattle either stayed in or they went through. He'd been managing this ranch through Montana winters longer than she'd been here, and he knew the risks better than she did. He went out. She kept the stove going and started supper and listened to the wind pick up and thought about $700 and the south barn and 4 horses that she wasn't allowed to suggest selling. She was still thinking about it an hour later when she heard the sound. It came through the rising wind from the direction of the northern road, a crashing sound, and then nothing, and then a voice calling, high and ragged, the kind of voice a person uses when they're trying to be heard over a storm and also trying not to panic and failing at the second part. She had the kitchen door open before the voice registered fully, and she was across the yard with her coat half buttoned in the time it took the wind to fill the space she'd made in the doorway. The wagon was in the ditch 20 yards from the main gate. It had gone over at an angle right wheel, dropped into the drainage channel, the whole thing tipped sideways. And the horse was down and struggling, and the driver was under the seat board, with his right leg pinned at the wrong angle, and his face in the snow, and he was alive because he was still making noise, but the noise was getting less organized. She got to him in the time it took to cross 20 yards of frozen ground. She got her hands on him before she fully assessed the leg, which she then assessed with her hands while she told him to keep talking. Keep talking. It didn't matter what he said. She needed to hear him saying something. And he said his name, which was Pete Alderman. He worked the north pasture, and she said that was good. Keep saying that. And she ran her hands along his leg with the particular focused attention that went somewhere beyond careful and into something she couldn't have named because it wasn't a skill, exactly. It was a kind of listening that her hands did, that her mind just followed. The tibia was broken. Clean fracture, not compound, the skin was intact, and the angle was bad but manageable. The immediate problem was the seat board. "Pete," she said, "I need you to breathe and stay exactly where you are. Don't try to move the leg. My horse, she's up. She's on her feet." She looked back. The horse had gotten herself upright and was standing with her head down and her weight distributed carefully away from the right front, which was probably bruised but not broken. "She's all right. You focus on you." She stood up and looked at the wagon. The board was across his upper thigh, not the fracture site, and there was enough leverage in the sideboard if she... Thaddeus came out of the dark at a full run. He'd seen the wagon from the north pasture, she gathered later. Seen the lantern in the wrong position, the shape of it, and come back without finishing the fence because he understood in the way you understand things you've come close to before that someone was down. He didn't ask what to do. He looked at the board, looked at her, looked at where Pete's leg was, and went to the downhill end of the wagon without a word. "I'll lift," she said. "You pull him out. You can't lift that. I can lift enough. It only needs to come up 6 inches for you to get him clear." She got her hands under the sideboard in the gap between the frozen ground and the wagon body. On 3. He moved into position beside Pete and got his hands under the man's arms. 1, she said. 2, 3. She lifted. It was not clean and it was not easy, and afterwards she would notice that her back had made a decision during those 6 seconds that it wasn't going to let her forget for several days. But the board came up enough, and Thaddeus pulled Pete Alderman clear of it with a single controlled drag that kept the broken leg from getting worse. And then the board came back down, and they were both kneeling in the snow on either side of Pete, who was conscious and in significant pain and remarkably restrained about expressing it. "How bad?" Thaddeus said. He was looking at the leg. "Broken tibia. Clean break. He needs to be inside, and the leg needs to be set." She was already taking her coat off and tucking it around Pete's upper body. "Can you carry him?" "Yes. I need you not to jar the leg." "I understand." He picked Pete Alderman up the way you'd pick up something fragile, all the weight in his arms and his back, legs supported, careful where he put his feet in the snow. Evelyn went ahead and opened doors and cleared the kitchen table in 45 seconds and had a lamp positioned before Thaddeus came through with Pete and laid him down. What followed was 2 hours of work. She had done fracture reduction in worse conditions than this, but not many. Thaddeus was her assistant without being asked. He held when she needed things held, applied counterpressure when she needed it, kept the lamp positioned right, didn't make noise when things got unpleasant, because things did get unpleasant. And through all of it, he watched her hands with the focused attention of someone learning something rather than someone waiting for something to be over. Pete bore it with the grim endurance of a man who had made peace, somewhere in the second hour, with the fact that this was just what the night was going to be. When it was done, and the leg was set and splinted, and Pete was lying on the kitchen table with a cup of whiskey Thaddeus had produced from somewhere and a wool blanket over him, Evelyn sat down in a kitchen chair and let her hands rest in her lap and just breathed for a minute. "He needs to stay off that leg for 6 weeks minimum," she said. "He can have the downstairs room," Thaddeus said. He was at the stove, and she realized he'd put the coffee on at some point in the last 20 minutes without her noticing. "He'll need looking after." "I know." He poured 2 cups and brought them to the table and put one near Pete and one near Evelyn, and he pulled up a chair across from her. He looked at her hands. "You're going to be sore tomorrow," he said. "My back is going to be sore tomorrow. My hands are fine." She picked up the cup. "The fence?" "2 sections loose. I got one secured before I saw the lantern." "I'm sorry." "The cattle didn't go through. The one I missed will hold till morning." He looked at Pete, who had his eyes closed, and his color was improving from the grayish-white it had been 20 minutes ago. "You set that fracture clean." "I've had practice." "Not here you haven't. Other places." She drank the coffee, which was too strong and exactly right. He was lucky it was a clean break. If the bone had come through the skin, we'd be having a different conversation. Thaddeus nodded slowly. "How'd you learn to do it?" "Surgeon in Billings taught me the theory. Experience did the rest." She set down the cup. "He told me I was wasting my time, that no one out here would take a woman healer seriously." He was wrong. She looked at him. He was looking at Pete, not at her, and his expression was careful in the usual way. But there was something in the words themselves that wasn't casual. They had the weight of an actual statement, not a polite thing said to fill space. "Yes," she said, "he was." By morning, the storm had dropped 14 inches, and the temperature was down to 18 below zero, and Pete Alderman was moved carefully to the downstairs room that had been used for storage and was now cleared out and reasonably comfortable, and Thaddeus had ridden out before 7 to finish the fence before the cattle tested it. News of Pete's accident spread the way. News always spread in Coldwater Ridge like water-finding level, fast and unstoppable. By the following day, Evelyn had 3 requests for consultations, 2 from families within a few miles of Ironwood, and 1 from a woman in town, whose youngest child had a cough that had been lingering too long. She went to all 3. She took the borrowed horse, and she went, because that was the work. And because she understood that in a place like this, you proved yourself not by announcing what you could do, but by doing it, repeatedly, until the announcement became unnecessary. What she didn't anticipate was Thaddeus. She came back from the second day of consultations to find that a broken step on the front porch, the third from the bottom, which had been cracked through and which she'd been stepping around for 2 weeks, had been replaced. New wood, set flush, nails countersunk clean. She stood on the porch and looked at it for a moment and then went inside. She said nothing about it. 3 days later, the woodpile beside her stove had been restocked. She had not asked for this. She had mentioned to no one that she was running low. But the stack was there, split fine and dry, and arranged in a way that made it easy to reach. She said nothing about that either. The lantern in her room had needed a new wick since the first week. She had been making do with the shortened one, trimming it lower each time, and it had reached the point where it gave barely enough light to read by. She came back from Mrs. Farrow's on a Thursday afternoon to find a new wick installed and the reservoir filled with clean oil. She stood in the doorway of her room and looked at the lantern, and thought about saying something when she saw him at supper, and then decided not to. Whatever this was, this careful, anonymous attentiveness, it existed in the space between them that didn't have a name yet, and she was not going to be the person who grabbed it by the arm and forced it into the light before it was ready to be there. She noticed. He knew she noticed. And that for now was enough. Pete Alderman was the thing that changed the town's understanding. He recovered faster than anyone expected. Evelyn monitored his progress daily, adjusted his treatment twice based on how the fracture was healing, and by the end of the third week he was upright with a crutch and calling himself inconvenienced rather than injured, which she considered a good sign. He was a talker, Pete, a quality that his convalescence had freed completely, and he talked to everyone who by, which turned out to be a fair number of people. Once word spread that the Ironwood healer was something worth paying attention to. By January, families were making the trip up the mountain road in conditions that Orville the wagon driver had once refused to face. They came in the evenings mostly, or on the days when Thaddeus was out, and the ranch had a slightly more accessible feeling about it. Cocks, lacerations, an infected tooth that she could do only limited things about, but which she managed well enough to relieve the worst of it. A woman with persistent headaches that turned out to be related to vision and required a specific set of exercises rather than medication. A man who had broken 2 ribs in a fall and hadn't told anyone for a week, walking around in that specific hunched posture of a person trying not to breathe too deeply, whom she had to talk to for 20 minutes before he admitted the full extent of what had happened. She set up a corner of the kitchen as a treatment space. Thaddeus said nothing about this. He accommodated it the way he'd accommodated most of what she did with a silence that was not permission, but was also not objection. The particular silence of someone who has noticed that things are improving and is not inclined to interfere. What she didn't know, and only found out later from Pete himself, was that Thaddeus had told him something. Pete told it to her straight, the way he told everything without editorializing. He'd been lying in bed one afternoon, and Thaddeus had come in to check on him, which Thaddeus did, daily, with a brevity that was its own kind of care, and Pete had said something about how lucky he was that she'd been there, and Thaddeus had stood in the doorway for a moment and said she knew what to do before she knew what was wrong. That's the kind you don't find easy. Then he'd left. Evelyn sat with that for a while after Pete told her. Then she went back to work. It was mid-January when Benedict Crowell came back. She was in the treatment corner of the kitchen working with the account books. Pete's presence had shifted some of the supply costs, and she was adjusting the figures when she heard the carriage on the lane and felt the same thing she'd felt in December, a particular alertness, like a shift in air pressure before weather. She didn't go to the front. She heard the door, and voices Thaddeus and Crowell in the hallway, then the sitting room, and she kept working on the accounts with the quiet attention of a woman who has decided that what she knows is enough, and what she doesn't know yet will make itself clear. Crowell's visit lasted 30 minutes. When it was over and the carriage had gone, Thaddeus came to the kitchen doorway and stood there with his arms crossed and his expression in the careful mode. "He's offering you a position," he said. Evelyn looked up from the accounts. At his ranch, as healer and household manager, he was watching her face. Better wage, better accommodations. He said stopped. He said a woman of your capability deserves better than a position like this one. She set down the pencil. He said that, more or less. She looked at him steadily. "And what do you think?" Something moved in his expression. "I think that's your decision to make." "What do you think?" she said again, more carefully. "Not about my decision. What do you think about what he said?" He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind had picked up again, the same direction as the blizzard, northwest, the kind of cold that didn't ask permission. "I think," he said finally, "that a man who buys another man's debt and waits 3 years to collect it doesn't make job offers out of generosity." "No," Evelyn said. "He doesn't." She picked up the pencils again. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, in case that wasn't clear. He stood in the doorway for another moment, and she was looking at the account book, so she didn't see his face, but she heard him exhale a slow, controlled breath, the kind that goes out differently than it came in. "The north fence still needs the second section finished," he said. "Then you should finish it," she said. She heard him cross the front room. She heard the back door. She heard his boots on the frozen ground, heading out, and she kept working on the numbers in front of her until the column balanced, which took another 20 minutes. And when it finally came right, she put the pencil down and sat back and thought about a man who bought a debt note and waited, and a man who anonymously replaced broken steps and empty lantern wicks and ran out into blizzards to fix fences before his cattle could get through. And the space between those two men was the whole story of what a person could do with power and what they could do without it. She got up and started supper. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the temperature was still dropping. Somewhere out in the dark, Thaddeus was working on a fence line in the cold with the same stubbornness he brought to everything. The refusal to stop doing the thing that needed doing, even when it was uncomfortable and thankless and done alone. Pete called from the downstairs room, asking whether supper was close. 30 minutes, she called back. I could eat a fence post, Pete said. You'd be better nourished, she said, and she heard him laugh. And the sound of it filled the kitchen in a way that she hadn't expected, the particular warmth of an ordinary moment in an ordinary evening. And she stood at the stove and felt it and thought, this is something. This is not nothing. This, whatever it is something worth staying for. Pete Alderman left Ironwood on a Tuesday morning in the third week of January, walking on his own with a cane that Thaddeus had cut from a piece of seasoned ash and shaped without comment, and left outside Pete's door one evening, like everything else he did for people, quietly, without expectation of acknowledgement. Pete made a production of leaving. He shook Thaddeus's hand for a long time and told him he'd have the fence work made up by February. And Thaddeus said the fence could wait, and Pete said it wouldn't. And they went back and forth on it, with the particular stubbornness of two men who agreed on the outcome, but couldn't agree on who was going to concede first. Then Pete turned to Evelyn and took her hand in both of his and said, You saved my leg. Maybe more than that. And she said she'd done the work that needed doing, and he should keep off it for another 2 weeks, regardless of what he thought he was capable of. And he said he'd try, which they both understood to mean he wouldn't. She watched the wagon take him down the mountain road and felt the house go quieter behind her, which she hadn't expected. Pete's presence had filled something in Ironwood that she hadn't named while it was there, and now that it was gone, she could identify it by the shape of its absence. He had been a third person in a space that was between her and Thaddeus, still learning how to hold two. Thaddeus went straight to the barn. She went inside and looked at the kitchen, which was now missing the cot and the supply of extra blankets and the particular smell of a person who had been in a space long enough to make it his own. And she thought, all right, this is what it is now. Just the two of us and the ranch and whatever is coming in 12 days. Because New Year's Day was 12 days away, and $700 was not in the account book, and Benedict Crowell had not come back since January, but his absence felt less like retreat and more like patience. She found the document by accident. She wasn't looking for it. She was reorganizing the supply room off the kitchen, a task she'd been putting off because the room was a genuine disaster. 3 years of things shoved in without system. Rusted tools mixed in with preserved food, mixed in with equipment she couldn't identify the purpose of, and she found it behind a wooden box of seed packets, folded inside a piece of oilskin. She almost put it aside without opening it. She almost did. She opened it. It was a loan agreement. The original, not a copy she could tell by the quality of the paper and the character of the signatures, the way ink goes differently into original paper than into a reproduction. 3 years old. $700 lent to Daniel Wren by a firm out of Helena. Thaddeus Wren as guarantor. His signature at the bottom in the same careful, slightly stiff hand she'd seen in the account book entries from before Ruth died, when the writing was steadier. There was a second document folded inside the first. This one was more recent. A transfer notice. The loan note had been purchased from the original Helena firm 18 months ago. The purchasing party was listed as Crowell Land and Cattle Company, registered in Billings. She stood in the supply room with both documents in her hands and worked through the arithmetic. Crowell had bought the note a year and a half ago. He had let it sit for 18 months. He had visited Ironwood twice, once in December when she'd just arrived, once in January when he'd offered her the position at his ranch. He had not come to collect. He had not applied legal pressure. He had waited, and while he waited, he had tried to remove her, which told her something she'd suspected but couldn't confirm until now. She was a variable he hadn't planned for. A ranch where 3 women had fled in 14 months was a predictable situation. A man drowning alone in debt and grief and the particular isolation that comes from being too proud to ask for help. That was a situation that resolved itself, given time and enough pressure. but a woman who walked up a mountain road when the driver refused to go, who set compound fractures on kitchen tables during blizzards, who had put $1 on herself in Richardson's betting pool and intended to collect, that was something else. She put the documents back in the oilskin and put them in her medical case, which was the one place in the house that was understood to be hers without negotiation. Then she went to find Thaddeus. He was in the south barn with the 4 breeding horses. She didn't go in immediately. She stood at the barn door and watched him through the gap for a moment, because there was something in the way he was with those animals that was different from how he was everywhere else, less armored somehow, less deliberate. He was running his hand down the neck of the largest one, a gray stallion with a coat that winter had darkened to charcoal, and talking to the horse in a low voice she couldn't make out. Not the way you talk to an animal when you're managing it. The way you talk to something when you're not ready to talk to a person. She pushed the door open. He turned. His hand stayed on the horse's neck. "I found something in the supply room," she said. She took the oilskin from her coat pocket and held it out. He looked at it. He didn't take it. Where was it? Behind the seed box. "I wasn't looking for it." He came forward and took the oilskin from her and opened it and looked at both documents for a moment that was long enough that she could see him working through the same arithmetic she'd worked through 20 minutes ago and arriving at the same place. "He bought it 18 months ago," she said. "I know." He refolded both documents. "I found out in September. The Helena firm sent a courtesy notice." She stared at him. "You've known since September?" "Yes." That's 4 months. "You've been carrying this since September." She heard the edge in her own voice and made a decision not to soften it. "Why didn't you try to do something about it?" "What was there to do?" He said it without heat, without defensiveness, just the flat statement of a man who has examined a problem from every side and found no exits. "I don't have $700. I don't have anything close to it. I can't borrow against the land because the guarantee means the land is already encumbered." He put the oilskin in his own coat pocket. "I tried writing to the Helena firm about a payment extension. They wrote back that the note had been transferred and any arrangement would need to come from the new holder, Cruel, who would not make any arrangement, because the point was never the money." He said it the same way she'd thought it, matter of fact, the language of someone who has had time to get past anger and into something colder and clearer. "He wants the land." "The horses," she said. He went very still. "Thaddeus." She kept her voice level. "Those 4 horses are worth more than $700. You know that. Don't." His voice came out sharp enough that the gray stallion shifted his weight and tossed his head, and he put his hand back on the animal's neck automatically, a steadying gesture. "Don't do that. I'm not doing anything except saying the thing that's true. There are things that aren't for sale." He was looking at the horse, not at her. "Those 4 animals are from my father's original breeding stock. There are 3 left in all of Montana from that bloodline. These 4 together are the only breeding group. When Ruth and I," he stopped, "started again, we had a plan for them after the war. When I came back, we were going to rebuild the herd from them, and the herd was going to be what carried this ranch into the next generation." He finally looked at her. His jaw was set in the particular way it got when he was holding something together by main force. "Selling them doesn't just solve a debt. It ends something." "I understand that," she said. "Then don't suggest it." "I understand that it ends something," she said carefully. "I don't agree that it has to end everything." He turned away from her and went back to the stallion's other side, putting the horse between them, which she recognized as the move. It was not hostile, exactly, but a placement that created distance. That said, he needed a moment to be somewhere she wasn't standing. She let him have it. She stood on her side of the horse and waited, and the barn was quiet except for the animals and the wind, finding the gaps she hadn't yet sealed in the east wall, and after a while she said, "He's going to take the land, Thaddeus. All of it, including the hill where Ruth is buried." His hands went flat against the horse's flank. "I know you know that," she said. "I know you've been sitting with it since September. I'm not telling you anything new. She stopped. "I'm saying it out loud, because I think you've been in here saying it to the horses, and I think you need to hear it from someone who's going to be honest with you about what it means." The silence stretched. The gray stallion blew out a long breath and stamped once. "If there was any other way," she said, "I would not be standing here." Thaddeus didn't move for almost a full minute. Then his hands came off the horse, and he walked out of the stall without a word and out the barn door, and she heard his boots on the packed snow outside going toward the north fence, which he always walked when something was working itself through him. And she stood in the barn with the 4 horses and the cold coming through the east wall gaps and thought, I may have pushed too hard. She didn't know if she had. She genuinely didn't know. He didn't come in for supper. She kept it warm for 2 hours and then covered it and went to bed and lay in the dark, listening for his boots on the porch, which she finally heard at nearly 10 o'clock, and then the sound of him in the kitchen, the plate being uncovered, the stove being checked. She didn't get up. She lay still and listened, and when she heard him go upstairs, she let herself exhale. In the morning, he came down earlier than usual. She was already in the kitchen, and the coffee was already made, and he poured himself a cup and stood at the window with it and looked out at the gray morning for a while before he said anything. What would you do with the money, he said, after the debt? She looked at him. What after the 700, if there was anything left? What would you do with it? She set down her own cup. That depends on how much is left. The Billings grain supplier is still owed. The hardware note. After those, she thought about it honestly. The cattle need better feed through February. The east barn wall needs proper repair, not the temporary work I've been doing. And if you're going to rebuild any kind of breeding operation, you'll need to start thinking about that in the spring. He was quiet. Those horses, she said, they're exceptional animals. Wherever they go, they'll be well cared for. The people who can afford horses like that don't mistreat them. That's not the point. I know it's not. She picked up her cup again. I know what the point is. He turned from the window and looked at her directly. You think I'm holding on to yesterday. I think you're trying not to dishonor your brother and your wife and your father all at once by selling the one thing that connects you to all 3 of them. She held his gaze. I think that's a human thing to feel. I also think that you can love yesterday and still have a tomorrow. He looked at her for a long time, long enough that she became aware of the fire in the stove and the particular quality of the morning light coming through the window and the sound of the horses in the south barn, distant but present. You don't have to destroy tomorrow, she said, to prove you loved yesterday. Something crossed his face that she couldn't fully name. It was too layered, too much happening at once beneath a surface that was still trying to hold itself still. He put his cup down on the counter. He went to the window again. He stood there with his back to her and his hands at his sides, and she sat with the silence and let it be what it needed to be. There's a horse buyer in Billings, he said finally. Man named Garrett. He brokered 2 sales for my father before the war. She said nothing. He'd give fair value, more than fair, for those 4. His voice was very controlled. He knew my father's breeding program. He'd know what he was looking at. Yes, she said quietly. I'd need to send a telegram. To get him to come out before New Year's, he still had his back to her. The snow's going to be bad this week. The roads might not be clear enough for a buyer to come up the mountain. I can ride to town, she said. Today, if you write it. He turned around. His face had the look of a man who has made a decision that cost him something real, and is not pretending it cost less than it did. I'll write it after breakfast, he said. She got up and went to the stove. Garrett the horse buyer arrived 4 days later, on a day when the roads had cleared enough for his wagon and the sky had gone to that hard, clear blue that meant the temperature was serious. He was a small, compact man in his 60s, with the efficient movements of someone who had spent his life around large animals and had learned to take up as little unnecessary space as possible. He walked into the south barn with Thaddeus, and he looked at the 4 horses with the particular attention of a man who knows exactly what he's looking at, and for the first 10 minutes he said almost nothing. He walked around the stallion twice. He checked the 2 mares' teeth and legs with practiced hands. He looked at the younger stallion for a long time, turned away, looked back. Evelyn waited outside. She had no business being in that barn during that conversation. She understood that without having to be told. There were things a person had to do alone, or as close to alone as circumstances allowed, and watching a buyer put a price on the last piece of your father's life's work was one of them. She stood near the fence and looked out at the mountain and thought about Ruth Wren, who had died while her husband was away and had been buried on the hillside before he came back, and who had apparently been better at account books than he was and had planned a horse herd with him and bought wool for a dress she never made. She thought about what it meant to love someone you hadn't known through the shape of their absence in another person's life. She had done it before with her own husband. After he died, She had come to understand him better through what he'd left undone than through anything he'd managed to finish. The barn door opened 40 minutes later. Garrett came out first. He gave Evelyn a polite nod and went to his wagon and began writing something in a small leather notebook. Thaddeus came out behind him and pulled the barn door closed and stood with his hand on the latch for a moment before he let go. He walked over to her. "He's offering $840, he said. She did the arithmetic quickly. $700 for the debt. $140 remaining. Enough to clear the grain supplier and put a real dent in the hardware note. That's fair, she said. It's more than fair. His voice was even. Careful. He said, my father's bloodline is worth more than that, but the market is thin right now, and he'd have to carry them through spring before he could sell. Are you going to take it? He looked at her. His face was, she searched for the right word and found, honest. Not open, not unguarded, but honest in the specific way of someone who has stopped pretending that something doesn't hurt. Yes, he said. Garrett came back with the notebook, and they completed the paperwork at the fence rail, standing in the cold with a pen that kept needing to be breathed on to write properly. And when it was done, Garrett counted out the amount in banknotes that he kept in a money belt under his coat, and Thaddeus put the notes in his own inside pocket without counting them, because he didn't want to stand there and count money while his father's horses were still in the barn behind him. Garrett loaded the horses himself, efficiently and without drama, and the animals went into his transport wagon with the resigned compliance of animals who have been well handled and trust the process even when the destination is uncertain. The gray stallion was last, and he turned his head once toward the barn door when Garrett let him out, a slow, considering look at the place he was leaving. Thaddeus didn't watch the wagon go down the mountain. He went inside. That night was the worst Evelyn had witnessed. It didn't begin until after midnight, but when it started, it had a different quality from the usual nights, more continuous, less able to surface. She lay in her room and listened and felt the helplessness of it, the particular form of helplessness that comes from knowing that what a person is going through has nothing to do with present danger and everything to do with something already past and already irrecoverable. And there is nothing a person can do for that except stay nearby. She got up. She made the coffee. She sat. He came down at 1:30. He was in his boots and his shirt, and his hair was disordered, and his hands, when he sat down at the table, had a slight tremor in them that she'd never seen before. He looked at the cup she pushed toward him, and he didn't pick it up. He said, I keep seeing the men who didn't come back. She sat still. From the war, his voice had a roughness in it that wasn't the usual roughness from sleep. The ones who were beside me in the morning and weren't there by evening. I can't stop seeing their faces in the exact moment before. He pressed both hands flat on the table. I've been seeing them since I came home. Every night. Some nights it's worse, and some nights it's manageable. And tonight I sold my father's horses and I came home from the war. And Ruth was already buried. And the man who needed the loan I guaranteed died in a place I was supposed to be. And tonight all of it is happening at the same time, and I can't. He stopped. The kitchen was very quiet. I can't put it down, he said. I've been trying to put it down for 3 years, and I can't. Evelyn looked at him across the table. She thought about several things she might say and dismissed all of them, because every response she constructed in her mind sounded, in the imagining of it, like an attempt to fix something that wasn't fixable, and she had spent enough time around people in genuine pain to know that the attempt to fix unfixable things was as its own form of abandonment. She said, I know. He looked up. I know you can't put it down, she said. I'm not going to tell you that you can, or that it gets easier, because I don't know if it does, and I won't say things I don't know are true. She held his gaze. I can tell you that you don't have to carry it alone tonight. He stared at her for a long moment. Then something happened in his face that she had not seen before, not a collapse, not a breakdown, nothing dramatic. Just a small, specific loosening, the way a fist goes when the grip has been held too long and the hand finally admits it can't maintain the pressure anymore. He talked. He talked for 2 hours, and she listened. He told her about the war, not the broad strokes she'd already inferred, but the specific texture of it, the cold and the mud and the particular sound a certain kind of silence makes when it follows a certain kind of noise. He told her about the men, some by name and some just by description, and the way certain faces had gotten lodged in him like splinters he couldn't reach. He told her about coming home to a house that had been looked after in his absence by neighbors who had done their best, and the way those best efforts had made everything worse somehow, because the house was clean and tended, And Ruth had been gone for 6 weeks already, and the bed had fresh sheets on it, as if the neighbors had thought fresh sheets would help. He told her about Daniel, his younger brother, who had gone to the war 2 years after Thaddeus, and had not been built for it the way Thaddeus had been built for it, if built for it was even the right phrase, which he doubted. Daniel had been a gentleman, a reader, someone who handled the horses better than the accounts, and the accounts better than any confrontation. He had borrowed the $700 to buy land adjacent to Ironwood, with the idea that the two brothers would run the ranches as a shared operation, the way their father had always hoped. He died before the purchase closed. The loan had gone unfulfilled. The guarantee had transferred. Thaddeus had spent 3 years paying for his brother's death and his father's horses and his wife's absence in a currency that didn't have a name and didn't have a bottom. When he finished, the kitchen was close to 4 a.m, and the coffee had been cold for an hour, and neither of them had moved from the table. He sat back and looked at the ceiling, and then at the table, and then at her. "You should leave," he said. She blinked. "I mean it." His voice was steady, but something in it had an edge she recognized as something different from anger, a kind of desperate sincerity, the thing a person says when they believe it completely. "I'm not going to get better than this. I know what I am. I've known it since I came home. You deserve a situation that isn't." He gestured around the kitchen, at the cold coffee and the worn table and the house that sat heavy around them both. "This. You're a good healer and a good person. And you've done more for this ranch in 2 months than I've managed in 3 years. And you should take whatever Crowell is offering and go somewhere that doesn't have the weight of everything I'm carrying." Evelyn looked at him. She looked at him for a long enough time that he shifted in his chair. "Are you finished?" she said. He stared. "I've seen the darkness, Thaddeus," she said. "I've been sitting in it with you for 2 months. I've been here for the coffee at 2 a.m. and the nightmares and the account book and the horses today. And I'm still sitting here." She leaned forward slightly. "Do you understand that? I'm still here. That doesn't mean. I'm still here," she said again. "And I'm going to be here in the morning, and I'm going to make breakfast, and you're going to take that money to Coldwater Ridge on New Year's Day and pay Crowell what you owe him, and that is what is going to happen." He looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read, complicated by exhaustion, and the 2 hours of talking, and something that might have been, somewhere underneath all the other things, something close to hope. Or not hope exactly. The precondition of hope. The thing that has to clear before hope is possible. "I don't know why you're still here," he said. "Because I choose to be," she said simply. "That's the whole reason. That's all of it." He sat with that. Outside, the wind had stopped somewhere in the last hour. The night had gone to a deep, settled quiet, the kind that meant the temperature had dropped below a threshold where even the wind found it inhospitable. "The new year is in 6 days," he said finally. "I know. $700. In your inside pocket," she said. "Plus 140. His mouth tightened. "I need to pay Crowell in front of witnesses. In town. So it's legal and recorded, and he can't come back with a secondary claim." "Yes," she said. "We'll go together." He looked at her. "You're going to need someone who can read the legal language when he tries to make the terms unclear," she said. "And someone who has been looking at your account books for 2 months and knows exactly what was owed and to whom." She picked up the cold coffee and stood up. "I'll be there." He didn't say anything else. She rinsed both cups in the wash basin and set them on the drying rack and pulled her robe tighter. "Go to sleep," she said. "Tomorrow you need to think about the east barn wall. There's a section near the foundation that's going to fail in the next hard freeze. I know about the east barn wall. And the Caldwell account still needs the corrected entry filed before the new year. I know about the Caldwell account." "Then you have a full day tomorrow," she said. "Go to sleep." He looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on him before, not quite amusement, but the structural cousin of it, the thing that lives beside it. Then he stood up from the table and pushed his chair in and went to the stairs. At the bottom of the stairs he stopped. "Miss Harrow," he said. She looked at him. "Thank you," he said. And then he went upstairs. She stood in the kitchen alone for a moment. The house was quiet around her, not the tense quiet it had been when she arrived, but something else, the quiet of a place that has let something go, that has released a pressure it has been holding too long and is figuring out what to do with the space. She turned off the lamp. She went to her room, lay down, and for the first time in 2 months fell asleep before the thought that was trying to form in her mind had time to finish forming. The 5 days between the night Thaddeus talked and New Year's Day had a different quality from the weeks before them. Not easier exactly, not lighter, but different in the way a room feels different after you've opened a window that's been painted shut. For years, the same room, the same walls, but something moving through it that wasn't moving before. He was up at the regular hour each morning. He ate breakfast. He worked the fence line and the cattle and the barn repairs, with the same economy of motion he always brought to physical work. And he didn't talk about what he'd said in the kitchen at 4 in the morning, and she didn't bring it up, because some things don't need to be discussed after they've been said. They just need to be carried differently. He was carrying it differently. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, not gone, not resolved, but redistributed, the way weight shifts when a second person puts their hands under the load. The nightmares didn't stop. She hadn't expected them to. They came on the second night and the fourth night, and each time she got up and made the coffee and sat, and each time he came down and sat across from her, and they didn't always talk sometimes. They just sat in the warm kitchen while the cold worked at the walls outside, and that was its own thing, that sitting, that particular willingness to be in the same room with someone else's darkness, without needing it to resolve into something tidier. On the morning of the 30th, 2 days before New Year's, she rode into Coldwater Ridge, not for supplies. She'd thought about this carefully and decided it needed to be done before the 1st, before whatever was going to happen at the general store happened, because there was a piece of information she needed to verify, and she couldn't verify it from Ironwood. She went to see Clem's story. The general store was busy for a Monday morning, which told her something about the weather forecast people stocking up before whatever was coming. Clem was behind the counter, weighing out flour, with the practiced efficiency of a man who has done the same task 10,000 times without making it mechanical. He looked up when she came in, and his expression did the thing it always did when she arrived. A slight recalibration, the adjustment of a man sorting out where to put information he's just received. "Miss Harrow," he said, "wasn't expecting you today. I need to ask you something," she said. She came to the counter and kept her voice low enough that the 2 other customers at the far end of the store didn't need to be part of it. "Crowell's note on the Wren property. When it's paid when the debt is settled in full, what's the legal process for recording the satisfaction?" Clem set down the flour scoop and gave her his full attention. "You'd need a written receipt from the creditor acknowledging full payment, filed with the county land office." He paused, signed in front of witnesses. Witnesses in what capacity? Does it need to be an official? For it to be uncontestable? 2 adult witnesses of sound mind, names and residences recorded. He studied her face. "This is for the 1st. Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Crowell's going to be here," he said. "He told me 2 weeks ago he'd need the store for a business matter on the 1st. I didn't ask the details. I didn't need to. He told you. He's been telling people, in his way. Not directly. But the Richardson wager's gotten bigger. There are people expecting to watch something happen on New Year's Day." His voice was neutral, but his eyes weren't. "People who think Wren's going to lose the ranch." Evelyn looked at him. "And people who are expecting you to be somewhere else by then," Clem added. "Crowell made another offer, I heard, for your services." "He did. You didn't take it, no." Clem nodded slowly. He reached under the counter and produced a piece of paper and a pen and slid them across to her. "If you're going to need witnesses," he said, "write the names down, and I'll make sure they're there. I'll be one of them myself if you want." She looked at him. "I've been in Coldwater Ridge 22 years, he said simply. "I've watched that man operate the whole time. There are people in this town who are tired of it." He pushed the paper slightly closer. "Write the names." She picked up the pen. "I was back at Ironwood by early afternoon. Thaddeus was at the kitchen table when she came in, and he had the banknotes from Garrett laid out in front of him, not counting them. She realized, just looking at them. The way you look at something that cost more than the number represents. She sat down across from him without taking her coat off. "When we go on the 1st, she said, "we need 2 witnesses. Clem Story has agreed. I need one more name." He looked at the notes. "Pete Alderman. He can make it on the cane? He'll make it on one leg if he has to." A brief pause. "He'd want to be there." "All right." She put her coat on the hook by the door. "Crowell is going to be at the store. He's been preparing for this. He'll have a version of what happens that he's been working out in his own mind, and it won't go the way he's planned it. He'll have legal language," Thaddeus said. "He'll try. The note is simple. Full payment satisfies the debt in entirety." There's no language in it that allows for partial satisfaction or extended terms, because he wrote it expecting you wouldn't be able to pay at all. She went to the stove and checked the fire. He wasn't planning for full payment. No, Thaddeus's voice was dry. Neither was I 2 weeks ago. She turned around. He was still looking at the money on the table, and his expression was the complicated one she'd come to recognize, the one that was simultaneously relief and grief, and something that wasn't quite either. We go in together, she said. We pay in front of whoever is there. We get the receipt signed, and Clem and Pete witness it and put their names to it, and then it's over and recorded, and he can't come back to it. He nodded. And whatever he says, she said, whatever he tries, you don't answer it in anger. You let him finish, and then you say what needs to be said, and nothing else. You think I can't manage myself. I think you've been managing yourself alone for 3 years, she said. And I think having someone standing beside you changes what you're managing toward. That's different from not trusting you. He looked at her. Different, she said again, and turned back to the stove. He gathered the banknotes from the table without a word and folded them into his inside pocket, and she heard his chair push back, and then his boots on the floor heading toward the back door, and just before it opened, he said, "The east barn wall. I'm going to finish the foundation section this afternoon." "Good," she said. The door closed. She stood at the stove and let out a breath and thought, one more day. Just one more day, and then whatever happens, happens. New Year's Day arrived with clear skies and a cold that had settled into the serious register, the kind of cold that makes the air feel thin and bright and slightly dangerous. The mountain road was hard-packed and passable, and they rode in on horses because the wagon felt wrong for this particular errand, too slow, too much like someone who wasn't sure they wanted to arrive. Thaddeus rode ahead of her by half a length, not deliberately, just the shape of the road, and she watched his back and the set of his shoulders and thought about all the ways this morning could go and which one she could prepare for and which one she couldn't. Pete Alderman met them at the edge of town. He was on his cane and moving better than she'd expected, his coat buttoned up against the cold, and his expression one of a man who understood what he'd been asked to witness and had something personal invested in witnessing it. "Ready?" Pete said. "Yes," Thaddeus said. Pete looked at Evelyn. She nodded. They walked to the general store together. The room was fuller than she'd expected. She'd known there would be people. The Richardson wager, Clem's comment about Crowell telling people in his way, the general quality of a small town's attention to the affairs of its most dramatic ongoing situation, she'd factored all of it. But the number was still something. 12, 15 people packed into Clem's store on a New Year's morning when most of them could have been home by a fire. And the room had the compressed, electric quality of a crowd that has come to watch an outcome it believes is already determined. She saw Richardson near the back, his feed store face arranged in the expression of a man already calculating his winnings. She saw 3 women she recognized from the consultation work she'd done in the past month, standing together near the dry goods shelves. She saw Mrs. Harrow, which surprised her the old woman had ridden in from 2 miles south, in this cold on a bad foot just to be here, which said something about what kind of person she was. And she saw Benedict Crowell. He was near the back counter, standing with a posture of comfortable authority, his coat immaculate, his hat on the counter beside him. And when Thaddeus came through the door, Crowell's expression did something that she watched carefully, a brief shift, quickly controlled, that moved from satisfaction to something more complex when he registered who was behind Thaddeus. He hadn't expected her, or rather he'd expected her on his side of the room. "Wren," he said, with the same warm surface tone he always used. "Right on time." "Crowell." Thaddeus came to the center of the room and stopped. The crowd rearranged itself around them, with the instinctive efficiency of a group that wants to see everything. "I'm here to settle the note." Crowell's expression was pleasant and practiced. "I appreciate you making the effort," he said, and the phrasing was deliberate, the effort, as if coming to pay a debt were an act of endurance rather than completion. "I should tell you, there's also the matter of the accrued interests." "There's no accrued interest," Evelyn said. The room shifted. Crowell looked at her for the first time since they'd entered, with the expression of a man choosing how to respond to an unexpected complication. "Miss Harrow," he said, "this is a business matter between—" "The note was purchased from the Helena firm 18 months ago," she said, "at the original terms. No interest clause. I have a copy of the transfer document." She had it in her coat pocket, folded in the same oilskin she'd found it in, because she had anticipated this exact moment. The note is for $700, principal only, due in full on the 1st of January. No provision for interest. The room was very quiet. Crowell looked at the oilskin in her hand. Something moved behind his eyes, a rapid calculation. He smiled, and it was his best smile, broad and easy, the one he used when he wanted to appear like a man who found disagreements charming. A clever reading, he said. But there's also the question of carrying costs. That's not language that appears in the note, she said. Mr. Story has read it. I imagine several other people in this room could read it too, if you'd like to make it available. Clem Story, from behind his counter, said nothing. He simply folded his hands on the surface and looked at Krill with the patient expression of a man who has been waiting 22 years for a particular moment and is content to let it arrive at its own pace. Crowell looked around the room. The calculation was visible now, less hidden than usual, because he was doing it faster than he preferred to. $700, Thaddeus said. He reached into his inside pocket and produced the banknotes. He put them on the counter in front of Clem Story. He did it without theater, not slapped down, not offered with a gesture, just placed there. Flat. Final. The way you put down something heavy you've been carrying too long. Counted and correct. In front of witnesses, no one spoke. Crowell looked at the money on the counter. He looked at it for long enough that everyone in the room understood he was looking at the end of something he'd spent 18 months building toward. His smile had not moved. It was fixed now, in the way of things held in place by effort rather than feeling. I'll need to verify the count, he said. Count it, Thaddeus said. Crowell came forward and counted the notes. He counted them twice. The room watched him count them twice in a silence that was somehow louder than noise. $700. Exactly. He stepped back from the counter. His face had rearranged itself into something that was almost, but not quite, gracious. I'll need to have my man draw up the receipt. I have the form, Evelyn said. She produced the second paper from her coat, a satisfaction of debt form she'd copped from a legal reference she'd found in the courthouse when she'd stopped there on her way to Clem's store 2 days ago. It was correct in every particular. She had checked it 4 times. Mr. Story and Mr. Alderman are the witnesses. If you'll sign where indicated. Crowell looked at the form. He looked at her. The smile was entirely gone now. You've been thorough, he said. It came out flat. I've had time to prepare, she said. He took the pen that Clem offered and signed the receipt at the bottom in the space provided. Pete Alderman signed beside it on his witness line, his signature slightly uneven from the cane but legible. Clem Story signed last, and pressed the store's date stamp onto the paper, and folded it and handed it to Thaddeus. Thaddeus put it in his inside pocket. The debt was paid. The land was clear. The hill where Ruth was buried was no longer leverage in another man's scheme. The room absorbed this for a moment, and then Benedict Crowell did the thing she'd been half expecting. He turned to face the room fully. He took his time about it, collecting himself, putting the smile back in a slightly modified form, warmer, more sympathetic, the version he used when he wanted to appear to be doing someone a favor. He turned to Evelyn. Miss Harrow, he said. He made his voice carry because he wanted the room to hear this. Your original agreement was a winter position. We're on the 1st of January. Your contract with Ironwood is more or less complete. He paused, letting that land. My offer remains open. Better wages, better accommodations, a proper establishment with room to grow your practice. You've more than demonstrated your ability. You deserve a situation that reflects it. The room was very still. He let the silence work for a moment, the way a skilled man lets silence work, waiting for the pressure of it to push things in the direction he wanted. He had read correctly that the room believed her to be the uncertain element. 3 women had fled before her. The wager. The whole shape of the past 2 months from the outside was a competent woman in an impossible situation, making the sensible choice when the sensible choice presented itself. He'd read the room. He just hadn't read her. She didn't answer immediately. She took the same pause he'd taken, not because she needed to think she'd known what she was going to say since approximately 4 in the morning 2 nights ago, but because some things deserve the moment they happen in. She looked at the room. At Richardson in the back with his ledger book face. At Mrs. Farrow standing near the dry goods with her bad foot and her patient, clear eyes. At the 3 women who had come to her for consultations, who were watching her with an attention that had nothing to do with the wager. She looked at Crowell. You've told people about this debt for 18 months, she said. Not directly, but in your way. You let it be known that Ironwood was circling, that Thaddeus Wren was a man going under slowly, and that anyone attached to his situation was attaching themselves to something with no future. She kept her voice even, because she wasn't angry. Anger would have made it something other than what it needed to be. You offered me a position at your ranch because you understood that a woman who stays changes the calculation. That a ranch with a working healer and functioning accounts and a man who's stopped drowning alone is a different problem from an empty house and a broken man. Crowell's expression was careful. I've seen everything this town whispered about, she said. I've been there for the nights that sent 3 other women running. I know what it looks like at 2 in the morning when a man is trying to carry a war and a dead brother and a wife he didn't get to bury and a debt someone held over him like a blade. She didn't look at Thaddeus. She didn't need to. I've seen all of it. She let that settle. I've also seen what none of you bothered to look for, she continued. I saw a man sell his father's horses, the last thing he had from the life he'd planned, rather than let his brother's name be associated with an unpaid debt. I saw him come out into a blizzard in the dark and carry an injured man out of a ditch without asking whether it was convenient. I saw him fix a broken porch step and stock a woodpile and put a new wick in a lantern without once expecting to be thanked for any of it. She looked at Richardson. I saw what the wager couldn't see, because you were all looking at what you expected to find. Richardson said nothing. The room said nothing. She turned back to Crowell. You offered me the easier life, she said. Easier isn't the same as better. I've known that since before I came to Coldwater Ridge. She let the words be what they were, not a declaration, not a performance. Just true, I'm staying. She moved to stand beside Thaddeus. Not dramatically. Not with a gesture. She just took 2 steps across the floor and stood beside him and faced the room, and the 2 of them were standing together in the middle of Clem Story's general store on New Year's Day, and the room looked at them and understood something that was going to take some of them a while to articulate, but that they all felt at the same moment. Crowell stood where he was for another few seconds. Your choice, he said. His voice had gone to a register she hadn't heard before, stripped of the warmth, stripped of the calculation. Just a man saying the only thing left to say. Yes, she said. It is. He picked up his hat from the counter. He settled it on his head with the movements of a man performing normalcy. He nodded to Clem, to no one else, and walked to the door and through it, and the bell above the door rang once and then went quiet. The room stayed very still for a moment after he left. Then Mrs. Farrow, from her position near the dry goods, said in her clear, dry voice, well, I'll be wanting my $1 back from Richardson. Someone laughed. Then someone else. Not the laughter of people who found something funny exactly, but the kind that comes when tension has been held a long time and releases all at once. The relief of a room letting go of an expectation that is no longer necessary. Richardson, to his credit, looked more thoughtful than embarrassed. He nodded once at Evelyn across the room, the nod of a man revising a position, and put his ledger in his coat pocket. Clem Story came around from behind his counter and stood beside the 2 of them, and Pete Alderman came up on his cane, and the 4 of them stood together in the middle of the store while the room gradually found its voice again around them. And Pete said to Thaddeus, in a low voice that only the 4 of them could hear, You know the fence work I owe you from January. I'm going to make it up double. I told you the fence could wait, Thaddeus said. And I told you it wouldn't. Pete looked at Evelyn. You put $1 on February. You're going to need to collect that. I intend to, she said. Clem said, I'll pour something warm if anyone wants. It's cold enough out there to justify it. They went to the back of the store where Clem kept a kettle and a collection of mismatched cups, and the morning went on around them, in the way mornings go on, when the thing they were organized around has been resolved imperfectly, in the messy and unglamorous way that real resolutions tend to arrive, not with flourish, but with the quiet relief of something heavy set down at last. They rode back to Ironwood in the early afternoon. The road was the same road it always was, same ruts, same pines, same long angle of climb, but something about the quality of the silence between them on the ride-up was different from the silence they'd ridden down in, fuller somehow. Not because more had been said they didn't speak much on the way back, but because the space between them had shifted, had stopped being the space of 2 people who were still finding out what the other one was, and had become something with more weight, more settled quality to it. At the gate, Thaddeus dismounted and held it open for her without making it a gesture. She rode through and waited while he latched it. The Caldwell reconciliation, she said. I still need to file the corrected entry before the end of the week. I know, he said. He mounted again, and they went up the lane together. And the East Barn Foundation. You said you'd finish it this week. I'll finish it tomorrow. Good. She looked at the mountain above the house, the way the winter afternoon light was hitting the upper pines, going from gold to gray at the edge, the grain supplier in Billings. After the hardware note is cleared, we should think about opening a different account. Someone closer, if there's an option. There's a supplier in the next county. My father used them. Better rates? Comparable. Shorter haul. Worth looking into, she said. They reached the barn and unsaddled the horses together, working in the efficient parallel that had developed between them over 2 months of doing things in the same spaces, not coordinated by discussion, just by the particular attentiveness that comes from sharing work with someone long enough that you understand their rhythm. She was hanging the bridle when he said, from across the barn, what you said in there. She waited. About the porch step and the woodpile. His voice was level, but she could hear the thing underneath it, the thing he was managing. I didn't know you'd seen all of that, I noticed, she said. I've been noticing since the second week. You didn't say anything. Neither did you. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't know how, he said. He said it without apology, without particular embarrassment, just honest. The way he'd been at 4 a.m. 2 nights ago, when the honest thing had come out because the other options had run out. I don't know how to do things the regular way. The way people talk and say what they mean outright. I don't know if I ever did, and the war didn't help. I know, she said. You're going to need someone who... He stopped. Tried again. You deserve someone who can say the things. Out loud. The way it's supposed to go. She turned around. He was standing by the stallion's empty stall, the stallion that was gone now. That was 3 days south of Coldwater Ridge by now, with his coat still on and his hat in his hands, and his expression doing the complicated layered thing it did when he had something he needed to say and was working on the architecture of it. I'm not asking you for anything, he said. I want to be clear about that. You've given enough to this ranch, and I'm not asking. I know you're not, she said. I'm just trying to say that I see it. He looked at his hat. What you've done here, what you gave up in that room today. I see all of it. She leaned against the stall behind her and looked at him. That's a start, she said. He looked up. Saying what you see, she said. That's a start. The barn was quiet around them. Through the gaps she hadn't yet gotten to in the east wall, the cold came in thin and steady, and the remaining horses made small sounds in their stalls, and the afternoon light was going fast in the way it went fast in January, without apology. I don't know what this is, he said, between... He stopped. I don't have the language for it. You don't need it yet, she said. When do I need it? She thought about it honestly. When you're ready. And not before. He stood there with his hat in his hands and looked at her with the pale gray-green eyes that caught the light differently in the barn than they did in the kitchen. And she looked back at him with the same steadiness she'd brought to everything since she'd walked up the mountain road in December with a bad knee and a medical case and a debt she refused to run from. I put a log on the fire before we left, he said finally. It'll need building up. Yes, she said, it will. They walked back to the house together in the cold New Year's afternoon. Not side by side exactly, but close to it. The distance between them, the smallest it had been since the first day. And the house stood ahead of them, solid and worn, and lit from inside by the last of the fire they'd left burning. And it looked, from 30 yards out, like a house that someone was expected home in. Which was, she thought, exactly what it was. February arrived the way February always arrived in Montana, without apology and without the courtesy of a gradual transition. The cold deepened rather than broke, the kind of cold that had weight to it, that pressed down on the rooftops and the fence posts and the frozen ground with a physical insistence, and the mountain road to Ironwood was passable on most days, but only barely, and on the days it wasn't, the ranch existed in a particular self-contained silence that Evelyn had come to understand was not loneliness but something else entirely. She collected her $1 from Richardson on the 3rd of February. She hadn't gone in specifically for that. She'd ridden into Coldwater Ridge for supplies and to check on Mrs. Harrow, whose foot had continued its slow, steady improvement through January with the patient compliance of a body that had been given the right conditions to heal itself. But Richardson was at the feed store when she stopped in for the grain order, and he saw her come through the door, and without a word he went to his till and counted out $1 and put it on the counter. Fair's fair, he said. Thank you, she said. The others in the pool, he cleared his throat. Some of them want to pay up themselves. Personally, she looked at him. You made an impression, he said, with the slight awkwardness of a man who is not accustomed to saying things like that and isn't entirely sure he should be saying it now. In the store, on the first. He picked up a grain sack and moved it unnecessarily from one side of the counter to the other. Some folks feel they misjudged the situation. People usually judge the situations they can see, she said. That's not a fault. It's just a limit. He considered this. I suppose that's a generous way to put it. It's an accurate way, she said. There was plenty I couldn't see from the outside either. She picked up the dollar, picked up her supply order, and left. Riding back up the mountain with the wind at her back and the valley spread out below in its winter gray and white, she turned the dollar over in her gloved hand once and then put it in her pocket and thought about what it meant to win a bet you'd made on yourself. Not the money, the dollar was insignificant, and she'd half intended to give it to Mrs. Harrow for the inconvenience of the cold weather visits. What she thought about was the specific quality of being right about yourself when everyone else was betting on the opposite outcome. There was something in it that wasn't pride. Exactly. It was closer to the feeling of having kept a promise to the version of yourself that made the original decision, which was its own quiet satisfaction. She didn't mention the dollar to Thaddeus. The hardware note was cleared in the second week of February. She did the accounts herself, brought the ledger to Thaddeus after supper one evening, and showed him the column that now read 0 where the balance had been. And he sat there and looked at it for a moment, and then said, "The Billings grain supplier is still outstanding." "Yes," she said, "but the terms are manageable now. If the spring cattle prices hold, it's gone by June." He studied the page. "You changed the filing system. The old one wasn't organized by date. I organized it by creditor and then by date within each creditor. It's easier to track what's current versus what's historic." He turned a few pages. "This is different from how Ruth did it." She waited. "She organized by transaction type," he said. "Feed separate from equipment, separate from labor." He turned another page. "This is clearer. Different ranches, different needs," she said. "What worked for the way the operation was structured then might not be the best fit now." He closed the ledger. He didn't push it back toward her. He left it in the middle of the table, between them, which was where it had been sitting for a month. A shared thing rather than a thing that belonged to one side or the other. "The spring cattle," he said. "I've been thinking about the bull situation. If I'm going to rebuild the herd properly, I need a different bull by May at the latest. The one I have is getting too old for the size of the operation I'm planning." It was the first time he'd said the words, "the operation I'm planning," to her directly. She registered it without making a thing of it. "What are you looking for?" she said. "There's a rancher east of Billings who runs Herefords and Shorthorn crosses. The cross does well in this climate. Better winter hardiness than straight Herefords." He had the look he got when he was talking about something he knew well, when the careful management of his expression relaxed into something more direct and sure. "I'd need to go look at what he has. It's a 2-day ride." "Then you should go," she said. "I'd need someone to manage the ranch while I'm out." She looked at him. "Pete can help with the heavy work," he said. "He's off the cane as of last week, mostly." He picked up his coffee. "I'm not asking you to do Pete's job. I'm asking whether you're willing to be here." "I'm willing to be here," she said. He drank the coffee. "Good." He set the cup down. "I'll go in March when the road's better." She pulled the ledger back toward her and opened it to the spring projection page she'd started. "If you're buying a bull, add it to the capital expenditure column. I'll adjust the spring forecast." He watched her write the entry. "You know," he said, "when I hired through the agency, I asked for a healer and a housekeeper." "I know. They sent me a bookkeeper and a livestock consultant who also does surgery," he said. She looked up. He was watching her with something that was, definitively and without ambiguity, the closest thing to amusement she had seen on his face since December. "I can write to the agency," she said. "If there's a discrepancy." "Don't," he said. "I'd rather have what they sent." She looked back at the ledger and wrote the next entry with a hand that was, for a moment, not entirely steady, and she was glad he was looking at the window and not at her. The locked bedroom opened on a Saturday morning in the middle of February. She was in the kitchen when she heard him on the stairs, the familiar sound, his particular rhythm on the steps, and then a pause at the top, and then a different sound, a key in a lock. the particular resistance of a mechanism that hadn't been turned in a long time. She stayed in the kitchen. She made no move toward the stairs. She heard the door open. She heard him in the room above her slow movement, the careful kind, the way you move in a space you've been absent from and aren't sure you're entitled to be back in. It went on for a while. She made the morning coffee and started on breakfast and let the sounds tell her what they told her without pressing them for more. He came down 45 minutes later. He was carrying something. She saw it when he came into the kitchen, folded over his arm, and it took her a moment to understand what she was looking at. Wool, a length of it, silvery gray, fine quality, the kind of material that didn't come cheap and didn't come easily this far west. It was folded neatly, as if it had been stored with care, as if someone had laid it away with the intention of coming back to it. He set it on the table between them. She looked at it. She looked at him. Ruth bought it 3 years before she died, he said. She was going to make a dress from it. She never got around to it. His voice was steady, but had a particular texture to it, the texture of something said carefully, because it matters too much to say carelessly. It's been in the cedar chest up there since before I left for the war. He put his hand flat on the folded cloth for a moment, and then took it away. I want you to have it. Evelyn was very still. I need you to understand what I'm saying, he said. I'm not giving it to you because you've replaced her. You haven't. You're not supposed to. He looked at the wool on the table, not at her. I'm giving it to you because I spent 3 years believing that loving her meant I had to leave everything the way it was. That moving anything was a kind of betrayal. He finally looked up. I don't think that anymore. She thought about what to say and found, for the first time in a long time, that she didn't have words prepared. She was a woman who generally had something ready, who had learned that the absence of a response in difficult moments created more pain than an imperfect one. But this was the kind of moment that the prepared responses didn't reach. That required something slower and less finished. It's beautiful wool, she said finally. It is. She had good taste. She had better taste than I had in most things, he said. I was aware of that. They sat with it. For a moment, the wool between them on the table, the morning light coming through the window, the coffee going from hot to warm the way it did when you forgot to drink it. I'll make something, she said. Something that does it justice. He nodded. She reached out and touched the edge of the fabric, just the edge, just her fingers on the folded border of it. It was softer than she'd expected. Someone had kept it well. Thank you, she said. He picked up his coffee cup. Breakfast? 10 minutes, she said. He went to the window and looked out at the mountain, and she looked at the wool on the table and thought about a woman she'd never met, who had bought this fabric for herself and hadn't lived to use it, and a man who had kept it locked in a room for years because he hadn't known what else to do with his grief, and how sometimes the most human thing a person can do is finally put down the thing they've been carrying long enough to hand it to someone who can use it. She thought, this is what it looks like when someone decides to be alive again. Not a grand moment, not a declaration. Just a man carrying a piece of folded wool down a staircase on a Saturday morning and putting it on a kitchen table. She got up and started breakfast. The proposal, when it came, was not what she would have scripted. It was April. The snow had begun pulling back from the lower elevations, the ground turning soft at the edges of the day, and the ranch had entered the particular busy season that follows winter on working land fence repairs and cattle, assessments, and the planning work that has to happen before the ground is ready for what you're planning to put in it. Thaddeus had gone to Billings in March and come back with a young Hereford Shorthorn bull that Pete Alderman, present for the arrival, called the finest-looking animal he'd seen outside of a county fair, and which Thaddeus had paid a fair price for and named nothing, because he didn't name cattle, which was one of the things about him that she had decided was simply one of his fixed qualities and not worth addressing. She was in the south pasture, checking the fence line after the thaw had lifted 2 posts in the southeast corner. It was not her job, strictly speaking, but the jobs at Ironwood had never divided neatly along stated lines, and she had been in the south pasture for other reasons, and had seen the posts and gone to look at them. Thaddeus came across the pasture toward her on foot. He'd seen her from the barn, she assumed. He walked with the direct, economical stride he always used, and when he got close enough she could see his face, which had the expression she had not seen before, not careful, not managed, not the closed version or the tired version or the version that was working something out. Just open, which was its own kind of thing on his particular face. He stopped a few feet away. I need to say something, he said. All right, she said. I've been working on how to say it for about 6 weeks, he said. I don't think I've gotten there. I'm going to say it anyway, because if I wait until I've gotten there, it'll be July. She waited. You came here to work a winter position, he said, and you stayed past it. And you've been fixing things, not just the accounts and the fence posts and Pete's leg, but things I didn't know needed fixing, or knew and couldn't face. You showed me that keeping everything the same wasn't honoring the past. It was just being afraid of the future. He looked at the fence post she was standing beside, and then at her. I don't want you to stay because you have nowhere else to go. I know you have somewhere else to go. You could go 10 places. I've watched people ride up this mountain in blizzards to ask for you. Thaddeus, I want you to stay because you choose it, he said. Like you said on the first. Because I think stopped. Try it again. I think what we have here is something worth choosing. I think it is. For me. I can't speak for you. The pasture was very quiet around them. A hawk was making slow circles above the tree line to the north. The new post she'd been checking stood straight in the thawed ground. Are you asking me to marry you? She said. Because I want to be clear about what's being asked. He looked at her directly. Yes. She had imagined this moment. In the vague and non-specific way you imagine things you're not sure will happen. She had not imagined it in a south pasture with mud on her boots and a fence post maul in her hand and a hawk overhead. But she had learned, in the past 4 months, that Ironwood had its own ideas about when things happened, and that most of them turned out to be the right time anyway. Yes, she said. He blinked, as if he'd been prepared for something more complicated. Yes, she said again, plainer. I'll marry you. He stood there for a moment with the look of a man who is braced for a longer conversation and finds himself suddenly on the other side of it. All right, he said. The southeast post is going to need to be reset, she said. The thaw lifted it 3 inches. He looked at the post. I see that. I can hold it if you want a tamp. He went back to the barn and got the post maul, and they reset the post together in the soft April ground, and neither of them said anything more about what had just happened, because some things don't need more words once the necessary ones have been said. They were married in June, in front of the same people who had watched Thaddeus put $700 on Clem Story's counter on New Year's Day. The ceremony was at the ridge above Ironwood, in the open air with the mountains visible on 3 sides, which had been Evelyn's single requirement regarding the arrangements. She had made the dress herself from Ruth's silver-gray wool, working on it in the evenings over 2 months. And it was not a complicated dress, she was not a complicated woman, but the fabric was extraordinary, and it moved like something alive. And when Mrs. Harrow saw it, she pressed her lips together for a moment, in the way of a person managing an emotion they've decided is private. Pete Alderman stood with Thaddeus. He had lost the cane entirely by March, and had made up the fence work he owed in double by April, as promised, with the addition of 2 days of barn repair he'd decided was owed on general principle. Clem Story came and brought his wife, who Evelyn had not previously met, and who turned out to be a woman of considerable directness and practical intelligence, who, within 20 minutes of meeting Evelyn, had offered a standing arrangement for medical supplies at cost. Richardson came. He stood near the back with his hat in his hands, and when it was over he shook Thaddeus's hand, and then Evelyn's hand and said, I misjudged the situation, and she said, so did I, at first, and he seemed to find that genuinely comforting, which was what she'd intended. Benedict Crowell was not there. He had, by June, begun the process of selling his adjacent property quietly, without announcement, through a land agent in Billings. The community learned of it the way communities learn most things, incrementally and from multiple directions. He did not leave immediately. The sale took time. But the leaving was already in motion, and everyone understood it, and no one said much about it because there was no particular drama left to extract from it. A man who had arranged his ambitions around another man's weakness and had found the weakness resolved he was simply a man in the wrong place. And he knew it. And the knowing of it was sufficient consequence for most of the people in Coldwater Ridge. Evelyn thought about him once, at the wedding, briefly, not with rancor, not with satisfaction, but with the particular clarity you achieve about a person when they no longer have any power over anything you care about. She thought, he understood leverage. He never understood what can't be leveraged, and she let the thought go. The years that followed were not uncomplicated. She had not expected them to be, and any account that said otherwise would be false to what they were. The nightmares did not stop. Some wounds have roots too deep and old to be pulled entirely, and the war had put things in Thaddeus Wren that were going to be there for the rest of his life. And Evelyn had known that since the first night she lay in the narrow downstairs room and listened to the sound of them, and her knowing it from the beginning meant she was never waiting for him to be finished with it, never measuring his progress against some imagined recovery that wasn't realistic. When the bad nights came, she got up and made the coffee and lit the lamp and sat, and he came down and they were in it together, which was not a cure but was a different kind of thing. The difference between a weight carried alone and a weight carried between two people, which is not half the weight but is somehow survivable, in a way the solitary carrying isn't. The treatment room she established in what had been the storage room off the kitchen became, over 2 years, something that required its own dedicated space, and Thaddeus built her a proper structure attached to the east side of the house, with a separate entrance and enough room for what she needed. He built it himself over 2 months in the fall, with Pete Alderman's help for the heavy framing, and it was not elegant. The windows were slightly uneven, and one of the interior walls had a lean that was about 3 degrees from plumb, but it was solid, and it was dry, and it was hers. And when he showed it to her finished, she walked through it twice, and ran her hand along the slightly off wall and said, "It's perfect," and meant it exactly the way she said it. "The window isn't level," he said. "The east window has character," she said. He looked at it. "It's not level. Build me a square window and I'll fill it with square patients," she said. "Meanwhile, the actual patients I have seen fine with the lean." He almost smiled. She counted it. The horse herd rebuilt slowly, the way honest things rebuild, not all at once, not with dramatic reversals of fortune, but year by year with choices they made together. They did not try to recreate the specific bloodline his father had built, because that bloodline was gone, and chasing the ghost of it would have been a different kind of staying in the past that she'd already talked him out of once. They chose horses based on what Ironwood needed now, what the mountain climate and the terrain demanded, what they could manage and develop with the time and resources they actually had. The first horses they bought together were 2 mares from a rancher in the next valley, practical animals, not spectacular, sound in the legs and sensible in the head, exactly what the situation called for. Thaddeus named them. He had told her he didn't name cattle, which was true, but it turned out he named horses, which she discovered when she came to the barn one morning to find he'd painted small wooden name signs above both mares' stalls. One said Eleanor. One said June. Eleanor, and she said, "Eleanor was my mother," he said. "June is the month we got married." She stood there and looked at the 2 signs for a moment. "June is also just a month," she said. "It's a good month," he said. She didn't argue. There was a conversation, 3 years after the wedding, that she would return to for a long time afterward. They were sitting on the covered porch on an August evening when the day had finally let go of its heat, and the stars were beginning to appear, and the valley below was going from gold to purple, in the particular sequence that August evenings produced. She had a cup of tea and he had coffee, and there was no reason for the conversation to start when it did, except that the evening had that quality sometimes, when the work was done and the day was finished, and there was nothing left that needed doing. And in that space, things sometimes said themselves. "I used to think staying meant settling," she said. He looked at her. "Before I came here," she said, "when I was moving from one place to the next, I thought that the women who stayed in one place and built something had simply run out of options, that they'd settled for what was available. And now?" She looked at the valley. The purple was deepening. Somewhere below, she could hear the cattle making the evening sounds they made when the temperature dropped. "Now I think I had it almost entirely backward," she said. "Staying is the harder thing. Moving is easy. You leave before the place or the person gets complicated, before you have to be accountable for what you've built or failed to build. Staying means you see all of it, the good seasons and the terrible ones, the ways a person improves and the ways they don't, the parts of yourself that a place brings out that you didn't know were there." She held the tea with both hands. "I didn't understand that staying could be the bravest choice." He was quiet for a moment. "You could have left," he said. "Plenty of times." "Yes, Crowell made it easy. He tried to." She shook her head slightly. "He didn't understand why I was there. He thought I was there because I needed the work or because I had nowhere else to go. He couldn't make sense of it any other way." "Could you?" he said. "At the time?" She thought about it honestly. "Not completely. In December I was there because I needed the work, and because I'd said I'd stay, and I don't leave things I've said I'll do. She turned her cup in her hands. By January, I was there because leaving felt wrong in the specific way of leaving something unfinished. And by February, I was there because it was where I wanted to be. The reasons changed. The staying didn't. He looked at the stars for a while. I almost told you to leave more than once, he said. I know. You did tell me once, the night after you sold the horses. You didn't go. No. What made you sure she thought about that? The honest answer was not simple, but she'd had 3 years to work on the honest answer. I wasn't sure, she said. I'm not certain I'm ever sure in the way you mean. Sure is for things that don't cost anything. The things that cost something, you make a choice about them. You decide, and then you live the decision. And sometimes the living of it tells you that the decision was right. She looked at him. This one was right. He put his hand over hers on the arm of the chair. Not a dramatic gesture, just a hand, placed. They sat there while the stars came out fully and the valley went dark below them, and the house breathed around them, with the sound of a place that has been lived in by people who intended to stay. The people of Coldwater Ridge would eventually stop telling the story of the wager. Not because they forgot it. Small towns don't forget their own stories, but because it was gradually absorbed into a larger story that made more sense. The story of the healer from Ironwood, who rode out in weather that kept other people inside, who set zones and managed fevers and talked people through things that medicine couldn't reach, who showed up when she was sent for and sometimes when she wasn't, because she had learned to read the signs of people who needed help but wouldn't ask for it. The story of Thaddeus Wren, who had been a man going under in the slowest, quietest way, and who had come back from it not dramatically but steadily, the way the land itself came back each spring, not all at once, not with proclamation, but reliably, season by season, with the kind of patience that doesn't announce itself. Clem Story said once, to Richardson, that the whole business had taught him something he'd thought he already knew. Richardson asked what? That the story you think you're watching, Clem said, is almost never the one that's actually happening. Richardson considered this. What was actually happening then? Clem thought about it. A woman deciding that a person's worth isn't determined by how easy they are to be around. He wiped down his counter. And a man learning that the dead don't need you to bury yourself with them. Richardson didn't have anything to say to that. He picked up his order and went out. Clem went back to his work. On the mountain above the valley, Ironwood Ranch stood in the late afternoon light with its fences straight and its fields in order and its treatment room window slightly uneven in its frame and smoke coming from the kitchen chimney, way it came every evening when supper was being made. The hillside above the north pasture had its marker, undisturbed as it always would be. The house had its memories, all of them, the painful ones and the ordinary ones, and the ones that were just a person doing the next necessary thing in a long series of necessary things that added up to a life. Inside, a man sat at a kitchen table looking at account books that balanced, for the first time in years, in both columns. A woman moved between the stove and the counter, and when she passed the table, she said something he responded to in 2 words, and she said something back, and he said something, and she laughed, not a polished, social laugh, but the real kind, the kind that arrives before you decide whether to let it, and the sound of it went through the house the way warmth goes, reaching into corners that had been cold for a long time. No one had expected this. Not Richardson with his ledger. Not Orville, who wouldn't drive the last mile. Not Crowell with his patience and his leverage and his certainty that a woman like Evelyn Harrow would, given a clear exit, take it. Not even Evelyn herself entirely, that December day when she'd walked up a mountain road, with a bad knee and a medical case and a debt she refused to run from, without fully knowing that what she was walking toward was a life she was going to choose and keep choosing for all the years that followed. That was the thing about staying. You didn't always know, at the beginning, what you were staying for. Sometimes you stayed because you said you would. Sometimes you stayed because leaving felt like the wrong shape. And sometimes, if you were patient and honest and willing to sit with a person in their dark without demanding that they produce light on your schedules, you stayed. Because what was being built between you was worth more than the easier thing. And you knew it the way you know the things that are true, and cost something not with certainty, but with the kind of quiet, clear-eyed conviction that doesn't need to announce itself. She had stayed through the winter, then through all the winters that followed, not because she had nowhere else to go, not because the options had run out, or the road had closed, or the choices had narrowed until there was only one left, because this was where she had decided to be, because the deciding had been hers, because a house that had been haunted by yesterday had, with time and work, and two people willing to be honest with each other in cold kitchens at 4 in the morning, become the kind of home that holds you not by obligation, but by the accumulated weight of all the ordinary things you have built inside it together, and that, in the end, is the only kind of staying that means anything at all.